The Long Road to Paris. Louis Vuitton was born in the year 1821, in a quiet corner of the French Jura, where winters marked the houses as if they were scars and manual work was the only way to move forward one more day. And growing up in that environment meant learning from a young age that life is built with patience, with the strength of one's hands, and with an attentive eye for detail, because any carelessness could ruin hours of effort. That rural region, surrounded by dense forests and narrow routes, seemed designed to temper the character of those who lived there, and that atmosphere forged the discipline of a child who could not yet imagine that his name would end up associated with one of the most recognized symbols of luxury in the world. With the death of his mother and, shortly after, that of his father, the idea of home became uncertain, and the relationship with his stepmother deteriorated to such an extent that, at 13 years of age, he made a decision that would change his life forever: to leave his house and his village with the determination to reach Paris, a city he knew only through stories in which noise, elegance, and the constant promise of progress were intertwined. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because to understand what you are listening to, one must imagine the scene. A thin boy, with no money and no guide, preparing to walk hundreds of kilometers toward a destination that existed only as a luminous idea in his mind. The journey began with that mixture of fear and courage that accompanies decisions that define an entire path. Louis advanced along the rural routes of eastern France, surrounded by mountains, fields, and small villages where time seemed to move at the rhythm of ancient trades. Each stretch was a physical and emotional test, because he did not know how long it would take or where he would sleep each night. But as he walked, he observed something that would later influence his career profoundly: battered luggage, deformed trunks, suitcases improvised with ropes and patches, objects that suffered with every change of season and every trip. Without knowing it, he was accumulating the sensitivity that, years later, would allow him to imagine a type of trunk that was more resistant, more functional, and better suited to an era beginning to transform with the railway and long-distance travel. During his journey, Louis accepted temporary jobs whenever the opportunity appeared. He could spend one day cleaning stables, another helping in a carpentry workshop, and several days carrying goods for merchants who needed young and willing hands. Every coin he earned was a guarantee of being able to eat one more day and, at the same time, a new lesson about the value of persistence. He slept wherever he could: stables, barns, abandoned sheds, or even on the roadside, when exhaustion defeated him. That routine hardened his character and strengthened a discipline that would later become a personal hallmark. As he advanced northward, the rural landscape began to transform. The routes became more traveled. The conversations among merchants spoke increasingly of machines, inventions, new factories, and cities that grew without rest. Europe was entering one of its great periods of change, and Louis, without being aware of it, was walking directly toward the center of that transformation. Paris awaited him in full industrial effervescence, with trains that were beginning to connect distant regions, and with a bourgeoisie that traveled more and more, demanding durable objects and impeccable service. His journey was no longer a simple, youthful escape, but an approach toward a city where his manual talent could find a space to develop. When he finally reached the gates of Paris, after walking nearly 500 kilometers, the impression must have been overwhelming. The French capital was a whirlwind of sounds, accents, and incessant activity. Carriages traveled along avenues full of shops. Artisans, workers, and aristocrats shared the same streets, although each one lived in a different world. For a teenager who came from the countryside, that represented a mixture of vertigo and opportunity, a city where no one knew his origin and where he could build his own destiny, shaped only by his effort and perseverance. Louis began to look for work in the neighborhoods where artisan workshops were concentrated. He wanted a craft that depended on precision, on care for materials, and on the ability to observe how urban life demanded increasingly elaborate objects. This is how he discovered the world of packing and preparing luggage, a trade in which the resistance of a trunk or the proper organization of its contents determined the traveler's comfort. That occupation captured him completely, because it aligned with his meticulous mindset and with his growing interest in understanding how the modern world moved. His dedication began to attract the attention of the masters of the craft. Louis learned quickly, absorbing each technique and method almost intuitively. The journey he had made had prepared him to work without complaining, to notice details that others overlooked, and to take on each task as a small personal challenge. His ability to understand the importance of a good trunk became his greatest strength, and the following years would be a silent training for a vision that was still forming within him. That long journey that began in his hometown was not only a physical displacement, it was a profound transformation, a process that turned a rural child into a young man determined to make his way in a gigantic and competitive city. Each kilometer traveled, each cold night, each temporary job, and each curious glance at the luggage of travelers contributed to building the foundation of a destiny that was about to begin its most decisive stage. And with Louis already settled in Paris, ready to absorb an entire world of techniques and demands, we enter the next phase of his story, where the doors of a workshop will lead him to his first great opportunity. Apprentice trunk maker for the elite. When Louis finally settles in Paris, after that endless journey that had taken him from the Jura to the heart of the French capital, the first thing he discovers is that the city can be as harsh as it is generous, and that to find his place in it, it is not enough to have had the courage to arrive. One must prove every day that one deserves to stay. In that context, the young man of barely 16 years old begins to present himself in different workshops, asking for work and offering the two things he has: hands willing to learn, and a tenacity that came from having survived the elements, loneliness, and the accumulated fatigue of weeks on the road. Paris, in the decade of 1830, vibrates with a particular energy. The streets are full of carriages, the shop windows begin to display objects designed for a bourgeoisie that wants to distinguish itself, and travel has become a social stage, where the status of a person is measured by the way they move and by the objects that accompany them. Within this environment appear the trunk and packing workshops, spaces where the noise of hammers, the smell of freshly cut wood, waxed fabrics, and metal fittings mix with the fierce demands of a clientele accustomed to commanding. Louis enters one of those workshops for the first time, that of Monsieur Maréchal, and encounters a world that, without knowing it, had long been waiting for him. The work of a luggage packer seems simple from the outside, but in reality, it is a complex art that requires observing, calculating, and anticipating, because each object has a weight, a fragility, and a different value, and the goal is for everything to arrive at the destination in perfect condition, even if the journey is full of bumps, humidity, or abrupt changes in temperature. Monsieur Maréchal's workshop specializes in that task and, at the same time, in the manufacture of trunks and chests adapted to the needs of each client. There, Louis begins as an apprentice, doing what all newcomers do, sweeping the floor, moving pieces of wood from one side to another, holding tools, watching without getting in the way, and learning in silence, knowing that in such an environment respect is earned with results and not with words. Day after day, he begins to understand the logic of the trade, choosing the right wood according to the type of journey, the way to reinforce the corners so they can withstand impacts, the way to line the interior so delicate garments are not damaged, and that decisive detail that will shape his vision of the future, the idea that each trunk is, in reality, an extension of the person who uses it. For Monsieur Maréchal's clients, who belong to the upper strata of Parisian society, luggage is not simply a container, it is a statement of taste, order, and power. Louis observes closely how ladies of the high society demand exact compartments for their dresses, hats, and accessories, and how gentlemen worry about their suits, documents, and personal objects, as if each piece spoke of who they are and what they represent. That constant observation begins to shape the mind of the young apprentice, who still does not design anything of his own, but already wonders how what exists could be improved, in what way a trunk could be more resistant, lighter, easier to handle in a world where travel multiplies thanks to the railway and growing commercial routes. When he is not working, he mentally reviews the structure of the chests he has seen during the day, remembers where the brakes concentrate, which parts deform first, and what complaints clients repeat. That habit of analyzing the product from the user's experience, even though it was not called that at the time, is one of the keys to his development as a craftsman, and above all, as a future entrepreneur. As months go by, his role in the workshop changes. He stops being only the boy who cleans and holds boards, and becomes someone who begins to receive more precise tasks, such as marking measurements, cutting pieces, placing interior linings, and participating in the packing of luggage that will travel long distances. His name begins to be spoken with respect among the workers, because he meets deadlines, does not complain about long days, and takes each assignment as an opportunity to prove he is capable of more. In a competitive environment, where apprentices come and go, that consistency turns him into a reliable figure, someone who can be entrusted with complex work knowing he will care for it as if it were his own. The workshop's clientele is a spectacle in itself. Aristocrats, wealthy merchants, high-ranking officials, and little by little, figures close to the court, who entrust Monsieur Maréchal with their most valuable belongings. Louis watches names enter and leave that appear in the newspapers of the time, people surrounded by luxury who demand an almost obsessive level of perfection. For a young man who comes from rural poverty, witnessing that parade of power has a profound impact, because it teaches him how the elite behaves, what they expect from the service they pay for, and how easily they can change suppliers if they feel even one detail has not met their expectations. From that contact with the most demanding segment of society arises a key lesson. Luxury is a promise of peace, a kind of emotional insurance that the client acquires so as not to worry about anything, and anyone who wants to work in that sector must be willing to assume an extreme level of responsibility. Over time, Louis's reputation as a meticulous packer grows beyond the walls of the workshop. People begin to recommend him for specific assignments, and at some point, that chain of recommendations reaches the ears of someone very special. Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, a central figure in French court life, known for her refined taste and influence in fashion. Being chosen to handle the Empress's luggage is not simply a professional promotion, it is a silent consecration that places the young craftsman on a completely different level. Suddenly, the boy who had arrived walking from the Jura finds himself preparing trunks, chests, and suitcases for the most visible woman in France, adapting each piece to the complexity of her official and private travels. That leap confirms to him that excellence does not go unnoticed. Even in a vast and stratified city like Paris, the court does not choose at random, and the fact that they trust him to organize the Empress's luggage shows that his discretion, precision, and ability to understand the needs of each journey have built a reputation that transcends his humble origins. At the same time, it confronts him with much greater pressure, because any failure could have direct consequences on his career. Each of Eugénie's trips becomes a test, a silent exam where the result is measured by the impeccable condition of dresses, jewels, and personal objects upon arrival. During that period, while working for the elite and moving in an environment where wealth seems endless, Louis keeps a very clear view of his own position. He remains an employee of someone else's workshop, an apprentice who has gained prestige but who is ultimately limited by decisions made by others. That awareness of his own limits fuels an idea that begins to pulse more and more strongly within him. The possibility of having a space of his own, of developing his complete vision of the perfect trunk without depending on the restrictions of a master. The entrepreneurial mind that had been forming in silence for years begins to envision a different future, one in which his name does not appear only as that of a competent craftsman, but as that of a creator capable of signing his own work. And it is precisely at that moment, when he already masters the trade and knows up close the most demanding clientele in France, that Louis dares to imagine the next step, that risky move that will lead him to become independent and to establish his own workshop in the heart of Paris. The birth of the workshop of dreams. After years working in Maréchal's atelier, watching the most distinguished members of Parisian society parade through its doors and packing the lives of others into trunks that never bore his own signature, Louis Vuitton begins to feel that his apprenticeship has reached a point of maturity, a sort of silent frontier where one no longer settles for executing orders flawlessly, but instead feels the need to make personal decisions, to shape something that represents him completely. In his mind, experience with the court, his direct dealings with Empress Eugénie, and his constant observation of the shortcomings of the era's luggage all blend together, pressing toward an inevitable conclusion. If he truly wishes to develop his vision of the perfect trunk, he will have to do it under his own name. Paris, in the 1850s, is undergoing a profound transformation. The Second Empire drives ambitious urban projects. The city opens up and modernizes, streets fill with luminous shop windows, and the bourgeoisie consolidates itself as the great protagonist of consumption, meaning there is now a public willing to pay for products that combine utility, aesthetics, and prestige. Louis perceives this change in the air as he walks along the avenues near the Opera, observing how the best-located shops take on an almost theatrical prominence, with carefully designed facades and signs that promise uncompromising quality. In this context, the idea of establishing his own workshop ceases to be a vague desire and becomes a concrete project with direction, specialization, and a clear value proposition. Luggage and packaging of absolute precision for those who cannot afford even the smallest failure in their travels. In 1854, after saving, negotiating, calculating risks, and trusting the network of contacts he has built over the years, Louis opens his own workshop on Rue Neuve des Capucines, a strategic location near Place Vendôme and the New Opera, a place where aristocrats and the well-to-do bourgeoisie keep their routines, shop, and make themselves seen. Choosing that street is no coincidence. It is a declaration of intent, a gesture that says his work is on par with the best suppliers in Paris. The sign outside the shop bears a promise that distills his entire philosophy, specialized in the secure packing of fragile objects and luggage, a phrase that sounds almost technical but is, in truth, emotional, because what he is really offering is peace of mind, the guarantee that what his clients value most will arrive safely at its destination. Parallel to this opening, his personal life settles into a form that gives his entrepreneurial leap even deeper meaning. Louis marries Clément, Émilie Pariot, and together they create a home that is not separate from the workshop, because at the time business and family typically share walls, noises, and worries. Their marriage will bring Georges into the world, the son who will one day inherit the maison and elevate it to another dimension. But at the moment the shop opens, the present is more modest. Few hands, many dreams, and a fragile balance between the income needed to survive and the investments essential to stand out in a competitive market. Every client who crosses the threshold matters. Every commission is important. Every compliment becomes another piece in a reputation still under construction. The workshop functions like a living organism. In the morning, visitors are received, measurements are taken, destinations and needs are discussed for a lady traveling with dozens of dresses, hats, and jewels does not pack the same way as a gentleman transporting documents and work suits. In the afternoon and evening, the space fills with sounds. The strike of hammers, the rasp of saws, the crackle of wood being shaped, and the focused murmur of artisans who now understand the standard Louis demands. Every piece that leaves the workshop carries an internal logic, a reason for being, a layout designed so that the client feels their trunk is not a mere container but a tool of order, almost an extension of their way of living. Louis attends personally, listening, asking, analyzing, and in that almost obsessive attention to detail lies the seed of something that is not yet named a brand, but already behaves like one. His relationship with the court and, above all, with Empress Eugénie remains crucial in this new chapter. Her recommendations, the occasions on which she chooses him to prepare her luggage before a trip or a stay outside Paris, serve as an invisible seal that endorses the workshop in the eyes of other potential clients. At that time, few things carry more weight than the word of mouth of the aristocracy, and Louis knows that each commission from the Empress is a silent showcase that places him in the minds of other members of the elite. That connection with the highest circles of power allows him to maintain a steady workflow that sustains the business, while his reputation travels from hand to hand, salon to salon, and carriage to carriage. Yet opening the workshop does not mean everything runs smoothly or that success is guaranteed. Behind the elegant facade are bills to pay, suppliers expecting punctuality, and material purchase decisions that can mean the difference between a reasonable profit margin and a dangerous loss. To become an entrepreneur in the 19th century is to accept that any illness, political crisis, or shift in fashion can endanger a newly born business. Louis lives with that uncertainty, and it is precisely this pressure that forces him to think about how to differentiate himself even further, how to ensure that his trunks are not just excellent, but unmistakably superior to the usual offerings, especially now that travel is multiplying and new competitors are emerging. On the nights when the workshop finally falls silent, when the tools rest and the smell of glue, wood, and waxed canvas mingles with the day's fatigue, Louis mentally reviews everything he has learned since arriving in Paris. the client's recurring complaints when trunks warp, the difficulty of stacking luggage in train cars and on ships, the weight issues that complicate every journey, and that persistent feeling that these objects are poorly adapted to the way people move in an era of rapid change. From that review emerge ideas that surpass the scope of the newly opened workshop ideas tied to a true evolution of the product. And it is precisely at that moment, with the business in full operation, a loyal yet ever-demanding clientele, and the daily pressure of sustaining a dream that could crumble if innovation does not arrive in time, that Louis begins to conceive the next step. The transformation of the trunk into something more modern, more functional, and aligned with the new rhythm of the world. The revolution of the modern trunk. During those years, when Louis Vuitton's workshop already operated with a steady rhythm, loyal clients, and a reputation that slowly grew within the elegant circles of Paris, the outside world was moving at a speed that forced anyone who wished to survive to look beyond the everyday ringing of the cash register. Railway lines expanded, trains connected cities that once seemed unreachable, steamships crossed oceans with a regularity unimaginable only a few decades earlier, and the act of traveling began to stop being an adventure reserved for a privileged few, becoming instead a habit of a bourgeois class increasingly confident in its own power. In that context, Louis, who had seen from the inside how traditional trunks suffered, understood that continuing to manufacture the same thing would be a direct path to becoming irrelevant, so he took the time to examine with precision the reality of his clients. Heavy luggage, impractical shapes, difficulty storing trunks in train cars and ship holds, and a constant wear that contradicted any pretense of modernity. For entire nights, while the workshop emptied and the noise of hammers was replaced by the soft creaking of resting wood, Louis mentally reviewed every trip he had heard about, every complaint he had listened to, every scene he had witnessed in stations and ports. He imagined luggage piled on top of one another, bulging trunks that wasted space due to their shape and wobbled dangerously, locks that failed, surfaces that warped with humidity, and he began to trace in silence a map of problems that cried out for a different solution. There is a moment when the disciplined craftsman gives way to the inventor who dares to question what everyone else takes for granted, and that moment arrived when he decided that the traditional form of the trunk, with its curved lid, no longer made sense in a world that had become rectangular, geometric, and designed to stack goods efficiently. The idea of the flat-topped trunk began to take shape first as an uncomfortable intuition, almost a bold challenge to custom, and then as a solid project supported by the most basic logic. If train cars and ship compartments were rectangular spaces, it was reasonable that luggage should adapt to that geometry in order to be stacked effortlessly, without the risk of falling, and making better use of every available centimeter. Louis realized that this simple alteration, a straight lid instead of a curved one, could make an enormous difference in the lives of his clients, because it would simplify transport, storage, and organization, while also reducing the wear that pieces suffered during journeys. The challenge, of course, was not only aesthetic. It required thinking about the internal structure of the trunk, the type of wood, the reinforcement of the corners, and the overall resistance, so that the flat shape would not become a structural weakness. Along with that transformation in shape, he added another fundamental decision: replacing heavy leather or traditional fabrics with a coated canvas. Lighter, water-resistant, and less prone to warping, a canvas that allowed experimentation with patterns and colors, and that opened the door to something hardly imagined at the time but which would eventually become crucial: the possibility for the exterior material itself to become a sign of distinction. Louis researched, tested, failed, started again, adjusted proportions, replaced nails with more suitable rivets, modified hinges, until he achieved a trunk that followed three key principles: resistance, lightness, and functionality. What he was designing, although he did not call it that yet, was a product perfectly aligned with the logic of the industrial age, an object created for constant movement and for a client who wanted to travel comfortably without giving up refined taste. When he presented his new flat-top trunks, the reaction was not immediate, because any innovation that challenges long-established traditions tends to encounter suspicious glances at first. Some clients viewed the change as an extravagance, something that broke with the classic image of the old rounded chest that had, for generations, symbolized safety. However, little by little, the first testimonials began arriving from travelers who returned delighted from their journeys. The luggage stacked better, occupied less space, endured impacts more effectively. The canvas resisted the rain, and the interior remained intact even after long and complicated trips. These comments became the best marketing campaign imaginable, spreading by word of mouth, passing from one family to another, reaching the ears of those searching precisely for that, practical solutions that demonstrated intelligence and modernity. The volume of orders began to grow, and the workshop on Rue Neuve des Capucines became too small for the new scale of production required by this quiet success. Louis needed a space where he could combine craftsmanship with an organization closer to a small factory, with clearly defined areas for cutting, assembling, covering, and finishing, and with easier access for transporting materials and distributing the finished trunks. That was how the Asnières project was born, a workshop built in a suburb northwest of Paris, next to the Seine River, offering him the possibility of expanding without losing control over quality. The location was not chosen at random. The river facilitated transportation of goods. The surroundings provided enough space to grow, and at the same time the proximity to the capital maintained a strong link with the most influential clientele. In Asnières, Louis organized work with a mentality that blended respect for artisan tradition with a clear intuition for the benefits of systematization. Each stage of the process had its own space. Each artisan knew their role, and yet the spirit that moved through the workshop remained one of extreme attention to detail. There, he experimented with new coverings and with patterns that would later give rise to designs as iconic as the damier, and he progressed as well in the development of increasingly secure locks and closures, eventually creating systems that were presented as pick-proof, a powerful argument for clients concerned about theft during travel. The flat-top trunk, reinforced, lightweight, covered in resilient canvas, and equipped with an ingenious lock, ceased to be a rarity and became a reference. On a business level, this period marked Louis' definitive transition from respected craftsman to creator of a standard that others tried to imitate. Imitations began to appear, attempts to copy the shape and certain functional details, which created a new kind of problem, protecting innovation in a legal environment where patents were beginning to gain importance, but were still far from absolute guarantees. Louis understood that by introducing such a striking change in the category, he had opened a door that others would want to walk through without having traveled the same path of effort, and that encounter with the reality of imitation would become a constant in the history of the house. He began to appreciate that differentiation could not be achieved solely through the physical product, but through something broader: the customer experience, the coherence of service, the reputation maintained over years. As Asnières consolidated, international expos began awarding prizes and recognitions to his work, and Louis used those distinctions as another tool to strengthen his position. He did not do so out of ego, but from the awareness that, in an expanding market, official symbols of quality helped clients orient themselves. The name Vuitton began to be associated with a very specific idea: modern luggage that could be trusted, crafted with a level of care that others failed to match. That association was the seed of an intangible value that, decades later, would become the heart of the brand as we know it today. And so, with the modern trunk already firmly established in the imagination of travelers, and with a workshop that had transformed into a small institution devoted to excellence, the ground began to be prepared for the next generation to take over, and for those initial innovations to become the starting point of an even more powerful visual and symbolic identity. Georges and the power of the monogram. When Louis dies in the year 1892, the maison that had been born from that young man who walked from the Jura Mountains to Paris is already a reference in the world of elegant travel, and its flat-topped trunks, its workshop in Asnières, and its reputation as a supplier to the elite have built something much more solid than a simple business. They have created a way of understanding luggage as a symbol of order, prestige, and modernity. At that moment, the responsibility of keeping that legacy alive falls upon the shoulders of his son Georges, who does not arrive unexpectedly, nor appears as a secondary figure, but as someone who has grown up breathing the smell of wood, listening to the sound of hammers and watching, since childhood, how his father transformed practical problems into refined solutions. Georges Vuitton does not inherit only a company. He inherits a vision of work and of the client, and he understands that this heritage must be respected, but also adapted to a time that is changing rapidly. At the end of the 19th century, the world accelerates. The universal expositions turned cities into showcases of progress. Commercial routes multiply. Photography and the press spread images and ideas at a speed never seen before, and the great fortunes travel with a frequency that would have surprised the previous generation. In that scenario, the surname Vuitton begins to be heard beyond France, and the brand becomes exposed to a phenomenon that will accompany its entire history: counterfeiting. The imitations of the trunks and suitcases begin to appear with an unsettling ease. Anonymous workshops copy shapes, proportions, and even details of the lock, trying to take advantage of the reputation Louis earned through decades of perfection. For many entrepreneurs, that imitation would be a kind of poisoned compliment, a sign that their product has reached the category of desired object. But for Georges, it becomes a real threat, because it confuses the client, diminishes the perception of quality, and erodes the identity of the house. The challenge is no longer only to improve the physical product. Now it is about building something that distinguishes it immediately in the mind of anyone, even before touching it, even from a distance. Georges's answer is born from an intuition that, seen in perspective, seems obvious, but that at the time represented an enormous conceptual leap. Luggage had to speak for itself through its own visual language, a kind of graphic signature that would work as a shield against copying and, at the same time, as a flag of identity. For years, Louis had focused his innovation on structure, on shape, on resistance, and on functionality, while Georges begins to look carefully at the surface, the exterior canvas, that space many considered secondary and that he understands as fertile ground to say something new. In the year 1888, the damier pattern had already appeared, a checkerboard of brown and beige squares accompanied by the inscription Marc L. Vuitton déposé, an explicit declaration that the brand was registered and wanted to differentiate itself. But the true masterstroke arrives in the year 1896, when Georges creates the monogram that would become one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet. Inspired by Victorian fashion for ornamental motifs, by the shapes of flowers, and by simple geometry that repeats harmoniously, he designs a pattern where the intertwined initials L and V coexist with four petaled flowers inscribed inside a circle and a diamond, all organized in a rhythmic grid that covers the canvas like a continuous mantle. That design does not arise as a simple capricious decoration. It has a very defined emotional and strategic weight. On one hand, it pays direct homage to his father, inscribing the initials of Louis on the skin of the product, integrating the family name into every square centimeter of the luggage, and ensuring that, forever, the founder's identity would remain associated with every piece that left the maison. On the other hand, it acts as a shield against imitators, because it is no longer enough to copy the shape of the trunk. Now, one would have to reproduce a complex, registered and protected pattern that the client immediately associates with a very specific quality. The monogram works almost magically in an era in which the logo does not yet have the centrality it has today in consumer culture. In ports, in stations, in grand hotels, those trunks and suitcases begin to be seen, covered with the brown canvas adorned with the initials and the flowers, and people recognize at a glance who travels with Vuitton and who does not. The brand stops being an intangible reference that circulates in salon conversations to become a visible sign, a message read without words, a symbol of status traveling attached to the surface of the luggage. And, unlike many brands that in the future will use the logo as a strident shout, in this first phase, the monogram integrates into the whole, with elegance and coherence, as if it had always been there. At the business level, Georges accompanies this visual revolution with a carefully considered expansion strategy. The Maison participates in universal expositions, wins prizes, appears in catalogs, and begins to make its way into international markets, especially in those countries where the aristocracy and the high bourgeoisie adopt French fashions with enthusiasm. Owning a trunk or a suitcase by Vuitton does not simply mean carrying good luggage. It means belonging to a circle of people who travel with a certain level of taste and who trust a house with a clear and visible tradition. The monogram acts as a letter of introduction in any customs office, in any dock, in any hotel hall. The creation of this visual language also introduces something new into the culture of the company. The awareness that the brand, in its broadest sense, is a strategic asset that must be cared for with the same attention as the quality of the product. Georges understands that every public appearance, every advertisement, every presence at a fair, and every story clients tell about their travels contributes to building a common narrative, a sense of continuity between what the house says about itself and what the world perceives. A kind of shared story begins to emerge, in which the surname Vuitton embodies ideas of reliability, refinement, and modernity, and in which the monogram acts as the unmistakable signature of that story. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, Georges's move offers a very powerful lesson. There comes a moment in the growth of a business in which improving functionality is no longer enough to differentiate oneself, and it becomes necessary to work on the symbolic universe surrounding the product, to give it an identity so clear that even those who cannot afford it recognize it and look at it with desire. That construction of prestige is not improvised. It is nourished by years of coherence between what is promised and what is delivered. And it is protected with decisions such as the registration of the monogram, the legal defense against copies, and a measured expansion that avoids turning the brand into something vulgar. As the 19th century bids farewell and the 20th appears amid technical innovations and political tensions, the House of Vuitton enters a phase in which the strength of its image and the quality of its product seem to advance hand in hand, preparing the company to traverse times that will not be easy, with wars, crises, and radical changes in the way of living and traveling. And it is in that context of consolidated prestige and a turbulent world where the Maison will have to demonstrate to what extent its identity is capable of resisting the blows of history. Wars, crises, and indestructible suitcases. When the 20th century bursts in with its increasingly fast trains, its universal expositions, and that almost naive confidence in progress, the House of Louis Vuitton seems perfectly aligned with the spirit of the era. The trunks travel in first class, the monogram is recognized in ports and stations, the international clientele grows, and the family allows itself to imagine a future of continuous expansion. But history has other plans, and in very little time, the world that believed modernity would bring only improvements will discover that it is also capable of producing destruction on a scale never before seen. In the year 1914, the First World War breaks out, and with it that glamorous sense of travel that had defined the previous decades stops abruptly. Many of the most loyal clients of the Maison are summoned to the front, the routes are interrupted, the ships are converted into military transport, and luxury becomes a secondary matter in the priorities of governments and families. However, even in the middle of war, there is movement, and where there is movement, there is a need to transport valuable objects, documents, and delicate materials that must arrive in good condition. The House of Vuitton is forced to adapt its production, to think of less ostentatious commissions, of more functional pieces, of discreet solutions for a time in which displaying wealth can become a problem. The workshop of Asnières, which in times of peace buzzed with orders for trunks intended for long journeys, begins to work in a more contained manner. But it does not stop. Chests and suitcases are made for specific uses. Structures are reinforced with difficult routes in mind. Orders are fulfilled for institutions and companies that need resistant objects, and meanwhile the company learns a lesson that will define its way of existing in the long term, even when the final client is not in an elegant salon but in a military convoy or a tense office. The standard of quality must not be lowered, because what is sold above all is trust, and that trust is measured precisely in difficult times. When the war ends in the year 1918, Europe is left exhausted, with destroyed cities, unstable economies, and a wounded population trying to rebuild its life. Luxury goes through a stage of redefining itself. It can no longer rely solely on ostentation. It must engage with a reality in which many households have lost family members and stability. Even so, little by little, travel returns. Some journeys for business, others for pleasure, and many out of necessity. The 1920s, with their mixture of euphoria, jazz, and artistic avant-gardes, open a window of relief in which the more affluent classes once again look to Paris as the capital of taste and fashion, and the Maison Vuitton benefits from this recovery. Its trunks, reinforced by the reputation earned before and during the war, become a kind of guarantee of continuity, a symbol that certain ways of life can resist even the most brutal conflicts. During this interwar period, the company adapts to new ways of traveling. Automobiles begin to gain prominence. Some daring individuals board the first airplanes, internal routes within Europe intensify, and different needs arise, such as more compact suitcases, luggage that can fit inside cars and reduced compartments, pieces that remain elegant but that adjust to these new means of transport. The ability of the Maison to listen to these changes and respond with specific solutions becomes once again a key to survival. It is not about endlessly repeating the classic trunk, no matter how perfect it was, but about transferring its spirit of solidity and organization to formats better adapted to the new rhythm of modern life. But when it seems the world is beginning to find a certain stability, history destabilizes everything once more. In the year 1939, the Second World War begins, and the impact is even deeper than the previous one. France is occupied, Paris changes hands, and the atmosphere of the city, which once breathed creativity and refinement, fills with fear, controls, restrictions, collaborationisms, and resistances. The House of Vuitton, like so many French companies, finds itself trapped in a dark reality, in which every decision has moral and survival implications. There are commercial agreements, relationships with the Vichy regime, strategies to keep the factory functioning and to protect, as much as possible, the family and the workers. It is an uncomfortable chapter, one that for decades was spoken of little, and that in recent years has been the subject of critical investigations. From the perspective of business history, it forces one to confront an uncomfortable question. To what extent is a company willing to adapt to an unjust political environment in order to survive, and what consequences does that have for its future reputation? In any case, beyond the specific nuances, the truth is that the Maison emerges from the war alive, with its basic structure intact, and with the ability to resume its activity as soon as peace returns to Europe. While many other companies have disappeared, fragmented, or lost their essence. In these years of conflict, the idea of an indestructible suitcase takes on an even more literal meaning. It is not only a matter of withstanding blows in the hold of a ship or a train wagon, but of resisting changes of country, sudden escapes, border closures, forced displacements, and lives packed into a few permitted belongings. The trunks and suitcases of Vuitton become silent witnesses to extreme human stories, from exiles and evacuations to diplomatic journeys under tension. And although the brand, in its campaigns, continues to associate itself in the popular imagination with pleasure and elegant travel, the reality of those years shows that its deepest value lies in that ability to maintain order and security in the midst of chaos. With the end of the war in the year 1945, the planet begins a vast reconstruction, and France finds itself in the task of redefining its place on the new geopolitical map. Raw materials are scarce, infrastructures are damaged, and luxury consumption resumes with caution. But there is a profound desire to move, to open once again to the world, to travel for reasons other than war. In that context, Louis Vuitton positions itself as a bridge between the past and the future. A house that represents a certain art of traveling, inherited from the previous century, and at the same time a provider capable of adapting to the demands of an era marked by the appearance of new technologies, such as the commercial airplane and the first transatlantic flights for regular passengers. For the Maison, these decades of wars and crises leave a double mark. On one hand, they internally reinforce the value of resilience, of austerity when necessary, of flexibility in adjusting production, and of the importance of maintaining the level of quality even when circumstances invite cutting costs and lowering standards. On the other hand, they project outward an image of solidity that goes beyond fashion trends. Clients, especially those who have had the opportunity to travel in different eras, know that the brand has withstood the blows of history and remains present, responding with the same standard of demand as in the times of Louis and Georges. That perception becomes an intangible asset of enormous long-term value. While the world was being reassembled and trains once again filled with passengers carrying suitcases and ships recovered their rhythm of crossings, a new way of traveling began to take center stage in the sky. Aboard airplanes that promised to shorten distances as never before, and that transportation revolution would present the House of Vuitton with challenges and opportunities that would change, once again, the way the brand understood luggage and life in movement. From steam to the global jet set. When the Second World War ended and the slow reconstruction of Europe began, the world of travel started moving again. but it no longer resembled what Louis and Georges had known. The great ocean liners still existed, trains continued to cross the continent. However, a new silhouette began to dominate the horizon of modernity. The commercial airplane, which promised to compress distances, reduce weeks into days, and transform the experience of moving from one place to another into something lighter, faster, and more spontaneous. In that context, the house Louis Vuitton, heir to a tradition linked to enormous trunks that crossed oceans, understood that the way of traveling had changed forever, and that its proposal had to adapt to this new speed, without abandoning the essence that had made it famous. The European and American bourgeoisie, which during the 1950s recovered its consumption capacity, no longer traveled with the same ritual as their grandparents. Luggage began to become more compact, business trips multiplied, weekend getaways appeared, short stays in capitals connected by air, and the image of the elegant passenger at the airport became an aspirational symbol of the era. In this scenario, Vuitton understood that the classic trunk still had its place, but no longer as the absolute protagonist. The future lay in lighter suitcases, in bags that could accompany their owner from the airplane to the hotel and from there to a meeting or a dinner, more versatile pieces that could withstand the rhythm of the jet set, that new global class that lived between cities, business, and leisure. At the product level, this translated into a gradual turn toward leather goods adapted to everyday life, bags and accessories that maintained the monogram canvas or the damier canvas, but were designed with moving bodies in mind, with hands that opened and closed, zippers in a hurry, with shoulders that carried weight for hours. In 1959, the house took a key technical step by reformulating the monogram canvas to make it more flexible, softer, without losing resistance. This change, which seemed like a material detail, opened the door to radically new shapes, no longer linked solely to the rigid format of the trunk, but to curved silhouettes, cylinders, structures designed to accompany the body. From that context was born, for example, the Papillon bag in 1966, with its tubular, almost playful shape, which broke with the strictly square image associated with the house. It was a design that breathed the air of the 1960s, a decade in which fashion became liberated. Miniskirts scandalized previous generations, and women claimed a more active and autonomous life. The Papillon hung from the arm of clients who no longer wanted to be figurants in a drawing room, women who drove, worked, traveled alone or with friends, and who needed a practical object that, at the same time, reminded them that they belonged to a universe of luxury. With these pieces, Vuitton slid gently from the world of luggage into the territory of the handbag as an object of daily desire. In parallel, a phenomenon that would be vital for the growth of the Maison took shape: the internationalization of its store network. During the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the brand increased its presence outside France, first in other European capitals, then in the United States, and, in a very strategic way, in Japan, a country that emerged as an economic and cultural power and that developed a very deep fascination with Western craftsmanship and luxury. The entry of Vuitton into Japan at the end of the 1970s was not a simple commercial move. It was the opening of a dialogue with a consumer extremely attentive to detail, with a high level of demand, and with an ability to turn the luxury object into part of a ritual of personal care. The scene of a monogram bag walking through the streets of Tokyo or Osaka acquired a particular meaning because it embodied that bridge between tradition and modernity that so deeply seduced Japanese society. On one hand, a product made with artisanal techniques and a clear historical legacy. On the other, a symbol of belonging to a global culture connected with Paris, New York, and the great capitals of the planet. For Vuitton, this market became a laboratory where the brand tested to what extent it could adapt to different tastes without losing its center of gravity, and the results were so positive that, with time, Asia as a whole became one of the pillars of its growth. The geographical expansion was accompanied by a broadening of the universe of the house toward less obvious territories. A powerful example was the incursion into the world of elite sport through sailing, with the creation in 1983 of the Louis Vuitton Cup, the regatta that served as the qualifying competition to select the challenger for the America's Cup. This movement, which might seem distant from the business of bags and trunks, was loaded with strategic meaning. Sailing was a sport linked to tradition, to technical precision, to long-distance navigation, and to a certain aura of elegance reserved for those who handled significant vessels and budgets. Associating the name Vuitton with that universe reinforced the idea of sophisticated travel, mastery of the sea, and a lifestyle in which luxury accompanied without flamboyance, as a natural part of the setting. While the logos of the Maison appeared on sails and trophies, airports filled with characters who embodied the new myth of the jet set. Business people who crossed the Atlantic in a matter of hours, actors who linked shootings in different countries, musicians on tour, aristocrats who still held titles but moved with an informality never seen in previous generations, in press photographs, in magazine features, and, later, in the first television programs that showed the behind-the-scenes of the lives of the famous. Vuitton suitcases and bags appeared as part of the landscape, sometimes without anyone naming them, simply as recognizable elements that confirmed to the viewer that this person belonged to an aspirational world. During these decades, the house maintained a delicate balance between tradition and innovation. It continued to manufacture trunks and rigid pieces for clients who valued them, preserved the Asnier's workshop as its artisanal heart, and, at the same time, never stopped exploring new formats of handbags, short trip bags, and small items such as wallets, cases, and accessories. Each of these products contributed to weaving a network of daily presence in the lives of clients, who no longer limited themselves to using Vuitton when traveling long distances, but incorporated it into daily gestures, such as paying in a store with a monogram canvas wallet or storing work documents in a folder marked with the initials LV. What is interesting from the entrepreneurial perspective is that this stage demonstrated how a brand could take advantage of a gigantic technological transformation, the shift from steam to the airplane, to quietly rewrite its role in the lives of people. Instead of clinging to the nostalgia of large trunks as the single emblem, the Maison chose to transfer the essence of its proposal, which was offering order, resistance, and prestige in movement, to formats that fit better with the era. Luxury stopped being linked only to exceptional long journeys and filtered into an everyday life in which constant movement was the norm. That success, that ability to accompany the leap toward the global jet set and to multiply the points of contact with the client, brought with it an inevitable consequence. The more visible the brand became, the more its presence spread across cities and airports, the more the risk intensified that its image would wear down, that the abundance of logos would turn desire into habit, and that tension between expansion and exclusivity would be the great challenge the company would have to face in the next phase of its history. Copies, expansion, and the risk of becoming ordinary. When the image of Louis Vuitton becomes consolidated as a synonym for sophisticated travel, and the monogram canvas is recognizable from several meters away in any airport, the brand enters a paradoxical phase. The more desired it is, the more it appears in photographs, films, magazines, and shop windows across half the world, the more it also becomes an attractive target for those who live by copying, imitating, and feeding off borrowed prestige. From the 1970s onward, counterfeits cease to be isolated cases and begin to turn into a massive phenomenon. The streets of certain cities start to fill with bags that attempt to reproduce the combination of browns, the flowers, and the initials LV with varying degrees of clumsiness. And that constant presence of cheap copies poses a serious problem for a maison that has built its reputation on the idea of extreme quality and exclusivity. To understand the dimension of this challenge, one must imagine the journey of a potential client. They see the authentic monogram in magazines, associate it with the economic and cultural elite, dream of it as a long-term objective, and at the same time grow accustomed to seeing it in adulterated versions in street markets, in the hands of people who would never set foot in an official store. Over time, that excess of visibility begins to wear down the aura of rarity, and the brand faces an uncomfortable situation. The symbol that once announced status can begin to seem noisy, omnipresent, even vulgar to certain segments. The paradox is evident. The success that amplifies demand also threatens the perception of luxury. In the midst of this context, key figures appear in the business history of Vuitton, such as Odile Vuitton, a direct descendant of the family, and Henri Racamier, her husband, an entrepreneur with a mindset very different from that of the 19th century craftsman. Together they understand that the maison can no longer be managed like a large and prestigious workshop. It needs a structure suited to the times, an organization capable of supporting international growth, negotiating with major department stores, thinking about licenses, agreements with franchisees, a network of company-owned boutiques, and stricter controls over distribution. In the 1970s, Racamire drives an ambitious expansion, opening boutiques in strategic locations across Europe, America, and Asia, professionalizing management, introducing modern leadership practices, and preparing the company for something that, at the time, was not so common in the world of luxury: going public. The decision to list on the financial market, which materializes at the beginning of the 1980s, turns Louis Vuitton into a new player on the economic board. It no longer responds exclusively to the tempo of the family and the workshops. It is also conditioned by the expectations of shareholders, by the pressure of quarterly results, by the metrics of growth and profitability. This brings with it clear benefits, such as access to capital to continue expanding, modernizing factories, opening stores, and launching large-scale campaigns, but it also introduces a tension that will be recurrent among major luxury houses: how to grow strongly without betraying the essence that made the brand valuable. Meanwhile, the battle against counterfeits is waged on several fronts. There are legal actions, lawsuits, the closing of clandestine factories, many of them more symbolic than effective, because the possibility of copying regenerates constantly wherever vigilance is weaker. At the same time, the effort to educate the customer intensifies. The details of finishing, the quality of stitching, the precision of the pattern, the sensation to the touch are all emphasized, as a way of reminding the public that an authentic Vuitton is something radically different from a crude imitation, even if the design looks similar at first glance. This pedagogy is not only technical, it is also emotional, because it appeals to the self-esteem of those who purchase true luxury, inviting them to feel that they belong to a minority that refuses to settle for imitations. Internally, the company is experiencing a time of euphoria and vertigo. The numbers are favorable. The new stores are performing well. The brand multiplies across the great avenues of the world and seems to be everywhere. But the family and its closest circle begin to sense something unsettling. If the pace of expansion is not managed carefully, the house runs the risk of becoming just another logo, a habitual presence in shopping centers, and the line between luxury and mass aspirational appeal can blur quickly. The executives are forced to think about strategies to preserve a certain perceived scarcity, to limit some collections, to care for the in-store experience, and to reinforce the narrative of heritage, craftsmanship, and history, so as not to be absorbed by the purely quantitative logic of the stock market. The decade of the 1980s intensifies these tensions. It is a time of accelerated globalization, of yuppies, of major corporate mergers, of brands that begin to understand the power of marketing like never before. In that wave, groups emerge that are capable of buying historic houses, of uniting champagne producers with fashion brands, watches, jewelry, in gigantic structures that seek to dominate the luxury market. Louis Vuitton, with its century-old prestige, its network of boutiques, and its presence on the stock exchange, becomes a natural target within this game of consolidation. Several actors approach with the intention of influencing, investing, or taking control, and the family becomes involved in a corporate chess match filled with interests, alliances, fears, and contradictory projects. In the midst of these maneuvers, Henri Racamire tries to maintain a balance between the need for capital and the preservation of the maison's autonomy. But the reality of the market is harsh. Shares move, stakes are bought and sold, and any misstep can open the door to a hostile takeover or the entry of a player with ambitions of their own. It is a phase of Vuitton's history that is less visible to the general public, accustomed to seeing storefronts and products, but absolutely crucial from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because it shows how a family business born from a craftsman can find itself dragged into a financial arena where the players no longer move with hammers and fabrics, but with share packages and acquisition strategies. At the same time, popular culture begins to view the monogram with a mixture of fascination and saturation. For some, it remains the definitive symbol of undeniable material success. For others, it becomes a sign that is too obvious, too easy to associate with ostentation, and this opens another internal conversation within the company: how to renew desire without betraying heritage. That debate will remain alive for decades. And in the 1990s, it will find a creative response with the arrival of artistic directors who transform the monogram into a canvas for contemporary art. But in this initial stage, the issue emerges as an increasingly clear concern in internal documents and in the reflections of those leading the brand. If we look at this stage through entrepreneurial eyes, we find several sharp lessons. Growth is necessary. Ignoring demand would be a mistake. But the way growth is managed determines whether the charm survives. Fighting against counterfeits is essential, even if they are never fully eradicated, because that fight sends a message of respect for one's own work and for the customer. Seeking capital in financial markets offers enormous opportunities, even though it requires playing a game very different from that of the family origins. Louis Vuitton experiences all of this at the same time, and that combination of expansion, external pressure, struggle for identity, and the risk of becoming ordinary prepares the stage for an even larger shift in scale, which will arrive when the Maison joins other giants of luxury under a single structure. And it is in that climate of ambition, negotiation, and fierce competition, with the brand more visible than ever, and at the same time more vulnerable to losing its singularity, that the door opens for new players, with a broad vision of the sector's potential, to step onto the stage and reshape the map of luxury in a definitive way. LVMH is born, and the game changes. In the middle of the 1980s, Louis Vuitton is no longer simply an admired luggage and leather goods house. It is a publicly traded company in full international expansion, caught between the shine of commercial success and the shadow of counterfeits and overexposure. The global economic context is marked by mergers, acquisitions, and the emergence of large groups that understand luxury as a sector with gigantic potential if managed with modern tools of finance and marketing. And this climate of corporate consolidation will be the stage where the next chapter of this story is decided. On one side is the family legacy, represented by Odile Vuitton, direct descendant of the dynasty, and by Henri Racamier, who has professionalized the organization, pushed the company to the stock exchange, and taken the brand to a level of visibility never seen before. On the other side, the figure of a man who is going to change the map of global luxury begins to emerge. Bernard Arnault, a businessman with a sharp instinct for detecting brands with history and growth potential, and a cold, strategic mindset when it comes to taking control of emblematic companies. While many still think of luxury houses as family fortresses, Arnault sees them as pieces on a board where something greater can be built. A group capable of dominating the sector on a global scale. The opportunity to unite paths arrives through the merger of Louis Vuitton with Moet Hennessy, a conglomerate that already brings together legendary names in champagne and cognac. The logic is clear. Bringing together under one roof brands that embody different facets of French luxury, from the table to the wardrobe, and using their combined strength to negotiate better locations, share communication investments, optimize the distribution network, and become an indispensable partner for shopping centers, airports, and emerging markets. Thus, in 1987, LVMH is born, an acronym for Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, a set of letters that over time will become synonymous with a kingdom of luxury. On paper, the merger sounds harmonious. In practice, it opens a period of tensions, alliances, and maneuvers that seem taken from a corporate intrigue novel. Henri Racamier, who had been the great architect of Vuitton's expansion, now finds himself in a structure where he no longer controls all the levers, where other important shareholders exist, where interests intersect, and where a new player, Arnault, gradually increases his participation in the group's capital. The latter, who had already demonstrated his ability to restructure companies in crisis and turn them into profit machines, begins to move with patience, acquiring blocks of shares, negotiating support, using any fissure in the original alliance between the different families and partners. The battle for control of LVMH is fought in board meetings, shareholder assemblies, offices where alliances are decided, and in the economic press, which begins to speak of Arnault as the wolf of luxury, someone who does not fear taking drastic decisions if it strengthens his position. Racamier tries to resist, seeks support, proposes alternatives, but the dynamic of the stock markets proves implacable. Whoever manages to gather enough shares ends up imposing their vision. Gradually, Arnault takes effective control of the group, until he becomes president and central figure of a structure that, from that moment on, will cease to be a simple sum of prestigious brands and will become a coherent project of global expansion. For Louis Vuitton, this change of command means an important shift in the way the business is conceived. The Maison remains the flagship, the jewel of the crown, the brand that generates a disproportionate share of the group's profits. But now it no longer acts in isolation. It is part of a constellation of fashion houses, wines, watches, jewelry, and cosmetics, and its financial performance directly impacts the group's ability to acquire more brands, open new markets, and consolidate its dominance. Arnault introduces a strict discipline. Profitability per square meter in stores is monitored in detail. The strategy of selective distribution is reinforced. Large investments are made in emblematic locations, and the image is carefully curated with global advertising campaigns that position French luxury as a universal aspiration. In this new structure, Vuitton functions as the locomotive of the group. Its industrial margin, based on a product that combines relatively scalable manufacturing with high prices, turns it into a constant source of liquidity that allows the financing of riskier bets in other houses of the portfolio. At the same time, its historic image serves as an anchor for the identity of the conglomerate. In presentations to investors, in annual reports, and in corporate narratives, the name Louis Vuitton appears again and again as an example of what the group wants to achieve with the rest of its brands, a synthesis of tradition, modernity, craftsmanship, and impeccable marketing. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the birth of LVMH marks a change of era. Until that moment, the classic narrative of luxury was told from the viewpoint of a single maison, directed by a family, with its workshops, its whims, and its particular rhythm. From the consolidation of the group onward, the narrative expands to a model where dozens of brands coexist under the same structure, share resources, benefit from synergies, and at the same time compete internally for budgets, attention, and strategic priority. That coexistence requires delicate management. Each house must be given enough creative autonomy to maintain its personality, but common standards of economic efficiency must also be imposed. For Louis Vuitton, which for decades had been a business deeply centered on its physical product, integration into LVMH brings with it another crucial consequence: the need to think of fashion beyond luggage and traditional accessories. Within the group there are already houses with long trajectories in haute couture and ready-to-wear, and it is clear that the way to dominate the cultural conversation around luxury passes through fashion shows, seasons, rotation of collections, and the creation of iconic images that flood magazines and shop windows. Vuitton must decide whether it wants to continue being essentially a high-end leather goods brand, or if it aspires to become a major actor on the stage of global fashion. The logic of the group, which aims to build large mega-brands capable of spanning several categories, pushes toward the latter. At the same time, the performance-oriented approach forces operations to become even more professional. Production processes are reviewed, investments are made in workshops and training, quality control is strengthened, and vertical integration is expanded by buying or partnering with key suppliers of leather, canvas, and hardware to ensure both excellence and the availability of materials at large scale. The store ceases to be a simple point of sale and becomes a carefully designed space to convey the brand's narrative, with renowned architects, interiors that resemble a hybrid between art gallery and boutique, and customer service that must be as impeccable as the product. While all this is happening on a structural and financial level, the outside world experiences an enormous cultural acceleration. Music, cinema, and television globalize trends, urban subcultures filter into the fashion discourse, and new generations of clients no longer settle for traditional status symbols. They want messages, stories, creativity. The group is clear that if Vuitton wants to remain the absolute reference, it needs a powerful aesthetic voice capable of reinterpreting the monogram and the legacy of travel from a contemporary sensitivity, taking it from train platforms and ship holds to the stage of fashion shows and the covers of magazines. And it is at this point, with LVMH already consolidated, with Louis Vuitton installed as the main engine of the conglomerate, and with the world of luxury entering the era of pop culture and fashion as spectacle, that the Maison opens itself to a decision that will completely change its relationship with the public, placing the creative helm in the hands of a figure willing to transform trunks and handbags into runway language, and to position the brand at the center of the global conversation on style and modernity. Marc Jacobs turns luxury into fashion. As the 1990s progress and the world begins to move at the pace of music videos, fashion magazines, and televised red carpets, it becomes increasingly evident within Louis Vuitton that something must change in the way the maison expresses itself. The monogram remains omnipresent. The leather goods division continues to deliver enviable economic results, and the brand occupies the best corners of major capitals. But the cultural conversation is shifting to another place, to the runways, to the figures of designers transformed into media stars, to collections that set the rhythm of the seasons, and to a kind of luxury that no longer limits itself to accompanying the journey, but literally dresses the bodies of those who star in that journey. In 1997, LVMH makes a decision that many at the time view as a risky move, and that is now remembered as one of the most intelligent strategic steps in the recent history of luxury, appointing Marc Jacobs as the first artistic director of Louis Vuitton, and entrusting him with something the house had never done, creating a pret-à-porter line and building an entire fashion universe around a brand that for more than a century had been defined by its trunks, handbags, and travel cases. By choosing Jacobs, a New York designer known for irreverence, for mixing grunge references with haute couture, and for understanding street culture like few others, the maison sends a clear message. It is ready to engage with contemporary culture without fear of getting its shoes dirty on the urban sidewalk. For Marc Jacobs, arriving at Vuitton means confronting a delicate challenge. He has in his hands a house with a monumental heritage, a monogram recognized across the world, a clientele accustomed to sobriety, and a production system focused on leather goods. At the same time, he has the freedom to build a clothing line from scratch, one that does not carry the weight of decades of internal tradition, allowing him to experiment with silhouettes, fabrics, and narratives without betraying anything pre-existing. His first major task is to translate the spirit of elegant travel, artisanal mastery, and French luxury into a runway language understandable to the youth of the late century, the generation that grew up with Nirvana's music and with supermodels dominating magazine covers. In his first shows for Vuitton, Jacobs begins to weave an aesthetic that connects the house's history with a very clear contemporary sensibility. He blends the rigor of well-constructed tailoring with sporty touches, introduces parkas over sophisticated dresses, plays with layers, and proposes a style for a woman who might step off a private jet and go directly to an art gallery or a nightclub. Travel is no longer merely a journey between cities. It is a state of mind, a way of inhabiting time without remaining still. The runway becomes an extension of airport luggage carts, but charged with a theatricality that makes the audience begin to see Vuitton differently. At the product level, the arrival of pret-à-porter has a multiplying effect. The clothing collections feed the visual stories that later appear in advertising campaigns, in magazine editorials, and in celebrity wardrobes. The handbags, still the heart of the business, find new ways to converse with that clothing, becoming integrated into complete silhouettes. They stop appearing as isolated objects in display cases and become part of an emotional ensemble. This is crucial. Desire is no longer directed solely at a handbag model, but at an atmosphere, at a lifestyle which, even if the client accesses it through a single piece, arrives charged with meaning. Jacobs understands that the monogram with all its history and symbolic weight can become his greatest ally if he lifts it out of solemnity and allows himself to play with it. From that intuition emerge some of the most influential collaborations in contemporary fashion. With Steven Sprouse, he introduces a gesture that, at the time, provokes scandal among purists and excitement among younger generations. Over the traditional brown canvas, he writes, in fluorescent graffiti, the name Louis Vuitton repeated almost chaotically, as if a street artist had intervened on the perfect surface of luxury. It is a collision of worlds, the urban culture and the aristocracy of consumption, and that collision produces something new that sells out in stores, generates waiting lists, and turns the bags into collector's items. Later, alongside Japanese artist Takashi Murakami, he takes this logic of blending high-end leather goods with contemporary art even further. The multicolored monogram on a white background, with its bright tones and almost video game-like aura, appears at a moment when Japanese pop culture, anime, and kawaii aesthetics are beginning to conquer the world. Vuitton aligns itself with this visual wave and produces handbags that look as if they came from a modern art museum, yet are everyday objects for those who can afford them. The collaboration with Murakami, includes smiling cherries, large-eyed flowers, and characters coexisting with the house's classic pattern, achieving something extraordinarily difficult, turning a historic logo into living matter, a code that welcomes reinterpretation without losing its original identity. From a business standpoint, these collaborations function as machines for generating desire and renewing the brand's cultural relevance. Each capsule launch sells out, appears on endless waiting lists, multiplies in the press, and, years later, fuels a resale market in which certain models reach prices higher than the originals. Moreover, partnering with renowned artists positions Vuitton within the conversation surrounding contemporary art, gives it presence in museums and exhibitions, and reinforces the idea that luxury can be a territory for creative experimentation, not merely a refuge of static tradition. Naturally, not everyone embraces these changes without resistance. Some longtime clients look suspiciously at the graffiti letters and the bold colors, and critics wonder whether the Maison is putting its historical dignity at risk by venturing so close to pop culture. But the numbers and the media impact demonstrate that the move has been successful. By opening itself to the street, to music, and to contemporary art, Louis Vuitton expands its base of admirers, wins over a generation of consumers who grew up with logos, sneakers, and graffiti as parts of their visual landscape, and proves that one can play with a symbol without destroying it. Meanwhile, the figure of Marc Jacobs becomes an asset in itself. He embodies the star designer who steps out to greet at the end of the shows, allows himself to be photographed with celebrities, talks to the media, appears in campaigns, and in doing so humanizes a brand that for decades had possessed a rather abstract face. Clients begin to associate Vuitton not only with a monogram or a type of product, but with a specific creative sensibility, with a tone, a humor, a particular way of blending the classical and the irreverent. This has a contagious effect throughout the LVMH group, which observes how a strong artistic director can elevate a house's visibility and desirability to levels that directly affect financial results. In terms of entrepreneurial learning, the Marc Jacobs era illustrates with remarkable clarity the importance of inviting external talent when a company reaches a point where craft and inertia are no longer enough to remain at the top. Vuitton had history, resources, boutiques, clients, and an excellent product, but it needed a new narrative, a conversation with the present, and that conversation is initiated by a creator willing to respect the legacy without being paralyzed by it. Transforming a luggage company into a global fashion house requires courage, flexibility, and a deep understanding that brands do not live on memories, but on their ability to generate desire in the now. By the end of this period, the Maison emerges transformed. It is no longer solely the house of trunks and travel bags, but a protagonist of Paris Fashion Week, a constant reference in editorials, a topic of conversation in art forums and popular culture, and, above all, a powerful engine of growth within LVMH. And that new position in which creativity directly fuels financial results prepares the ground for the brand to become the central pillar of a luxury empire that, in the following decades, will dominate the global market with a strength difficult to imagine in the days when a young man walked from the Jura toward Paris. Engine of the global luxury empire. At the beginning of the 2000s, the picture of Louis Vuitton was entirely different from the one known by Louis Georges, or even the first generations of heirs. The Maison had ceased to be an independent house, and had become the financial heart of LVMH, the most powerful luxury group on the planet. Every decision taken within its workshops, its offices, and its boutiques had repercussions far beyond a simple annual balance sheet, because it affected the conglomerate's ability to continue acquiring brands, opening markets, and sustaining a narrative in which French luxury appeared as a kind of global standard of elegance. During those years, Vuitton consolidated itself as the profit machine of the group, an expression repeated in economic analyses that reflected something very specific. While other houses in the portfolio lived through cycles, experimented, and entered phases of investment and transformation, Louis Vuitton maintained a steady and growing capacity to generate revenue, supported by a blend of iconic leather goods, powerful fashion collections, jewelry, footwear, and a network of boutiques carefully placed in locations where money, culture, and high-level tourism intersected. Every new opening on an emblematic avenue, at an international airport, or in an Asian luxury mall had behind it a battery of studies, projections, and negotiations that recognized that the LV logo on a facade was equivalent to a magnet for aspirational consumption. The boutiques ceased to be simple points of sale and became stages, almost museum-like experiences, in which the client entered to see, touch, and walk through spaces conceived by architects and interior designers who understood that the place where the product was sold was a fundamental part of the product itself. In Tokyo, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in New York, in Paris, in Dubai, the stores filled with sculptural staircases, artistic installations, plays of light, and noble materials that conversed with the collections, and each flagship store acted as an architectural manifesto of what the brand wished to express at that moment. The message was clear. Vuitton did not sell only bags and clothing. It proposed a way of being in the world, a choreography of gestures, spaces, and objects. In parallel, the weight of Asia within the business grew at a dizzying pace. What had begun decades earlier with the opening to the Japanese market expanded to South Korea, mainland China, and other countries in the region, where an emerging middle and upper class sought symbols to express their new standard of living. For many of those clients, Louis Vuitton represented luxury par excellence, the first name associated with the idea of, "I have earned this," and the Maison understood that such an emotional link needed to be carefully nurtured. Models designed specifically for those markets were launched. The product offering was adapted to their tastes. Specific campaigns with local celebrities were created, and emblematic buildings were chosen as a demonstration of long-term commitment to those cities. Meanwhile, popular culture in the West was also changing its relationship with the LV logo. Rappers, R&B singers, pop stars, and elite athletes adopted the brand as part of their symbolic uniformity. They mentioned it in song lyrics, displayed it in music videos, integrated it into outfits that mixed haute couture with street elements, and that constant presence in music and film broadened even further the Maison's sphere of influence. Suddenly, an adolescent in a modest neighborhood might never have set foot in a boutique, but still knew perfectly well what Vuitton represented, because they had seen it on screen, because their idols used it as a synonym of success and escape. This phenomenon caused luxury to cease being an affair reserved for traditional elites, and to open itself to a global audience connected through pop culture. From its decision-making center, the company navigated this symbolic expansion with a mixture of enthusiasm and caution. On the one hand, visibility had never been so high, and that translated into historic sales, waiting lists for certain bags, a vibrant resale market, and massive presence on social networks as these began to dominate public conversation. On the other hand, management knew that there was a fine line between being a universal object of desire and becoming a simple symbol repeated to exhaustion. To keep the flame of desire alive, distribution of certain pieces was limited, special editions were released, and the concept of exclusivity within the accessible was refined, a delicate game in which the client felt they could enter the brand, but within it, there were levels still reserved for those who moved in more privileged circles. Another essential part of this stage was the relationship with the digital world. As the internet transformed consumer habits, Louis Vuitton faced an important strategic question: how to enter electronic commerce without diluting the luxury experience lived in the store. The solution involved building online platforms that replicated, as closely as possible, the sensation of personalized attention, with carefully produced photographs, detailed descriptions, concierge services, and logistics that guaranteed that the product reached the client with the same level of care as if they picked it up in person. Digital commerce was added to the boutique network rather than replacing it, becoming an essential path to reach clients who lived far from major capitals but had the purchasing power to participate in the universe of the brand. Behind this visible growth, an industrial structure was also transforming. The Maison invested in workshops in France and other European countries, trained new generations of artisans, reinforced quality controls, and worked closely with suppliers of leather, fabrics, and metals to guarantee a supply chain capable of meeting demand without sacrificing standards. This part of the story often remained hidden behind the lights of the runways and the shop windows, but it was essential to understanding the model. Vuitton operated on an enormous scale without abandoning manual techniques, and that implied an effort of organization and continuous training that was often overlooked when discussing luxury. In the years following the 2008 financial crisis, the market demonstrated something that many analysts had suspected. Well-positioned luxury brands with a strong identity and a loyal client base resisted economic uncertainty better than other categories. While many sectors suffered dramatic declines, Louis Vuitton maintained robust figures, supported by clients who viewed its products almost as investments, objects that would retain value over time, and that also offered a form of gratification during periods of stress. This resilience turned the Maison into a kind of internal insurance for LVMH, a pillar supporting other, more volatile bets. External recognition was not long in coming. Consulting firms, brand value rankings, and specialized analyses repeatedly placed Louis Vuitton among the most valuable brands in the world, not only within the luxury sector but in the global business landscape. These lists, which combined financial data with public perception, were important because they confirmed that the Maison had achieved something particularly difficult, transforming a 19th-century artisanal legacy into a contemporary tool for creating intangible value that translated into very real revenue. The LV logo was not merely a beautiful symbol. It was an asset, measured, analyzed, and protected with the same intensity as a technological patent. In this context, the figure of the creative director became increasingly strategic. Marc Jacobs's era had demonstrated that a strong vision could ignite the brand's cultural relevance, and after his departure, other creatives took on the task of keeping that conversation with the present alive. Nicolas Ghesquière, for example, in the women's line, brought his futuristic sensibility, his way of playing with volumes, and his interest in a type of woman who combined strength, elegance, and a certain modern melancholy. In parallel, different teams worked on the men's line, on watchmaking, on jewelry, on fragrances, building a universe in which every category had to meet the overall level of demand. Vuitton was no longer a single product house. It was an ecosystem. At the same time, the brand's discourse began integrating themes that went beyond aesthetics and status. Sustainability, social responsibility, material traceability, emissions, and environmental commitments. Part of this reflected real pressure from public opinion and governments, and part of it came from the understanding that the luxury of the future could not rely on the idea of blind consumption, but rather on the creation of objects designed to last and to have the lowest possible impact on a planet already showing clear signs of exhaustion. For a company born producing trunks intended to serve across generations, this shift toward responsible durability fit naturally within its narrative, even though it required concrete changes in processes and materials. In summary, during the decades of the 2000s and the 2010s, Louis Vuitton reaffirmed itself as the backbone of a luxury empire, generated profits that financed the group's expansion, dominated the physical space of major cities, integrated itself into global popular culture, and advanced step by step in incorporating the digital world and new social sensibilities. However, one territory was still left to be conquered decisively. Forging a deep connection with a generation that had grown up among sneakers, the internet, and urban culture, one that was beginning to view luxury through different eyes, more interested in authenticity and the intersection between street and high fashion than in classical salon rituals. And it would be precisely in this search for connection with the energy of the street, with diversity, and with creativity born far from the grand boulevards, that the Maison would make a historic decision by inviting a creator who arrived from the world of streetwear, architecture, and music to direct its men's line and to rewrite, once more, the meaning of wearing a Louis Vuitton. Virgil Abloh and the streetwear revolution. When Louis Vuitton announces in the year 2018 that the new artistic director of the menswear line will be Virgil Abloh, the impact is felt far beyond the usual fashion circuit. The news spreads across social networks, mainstream newspapers, and groups of friends who perhaps had never paid attention to who designed runway suits, because the choice of that name means a change of language, a gesture that connects directly with a generation that grew up among sneakers, mixtapes, internet forums, and oversized clothing. The Maison that for more than a century had been a symbol of elite travel and classic luxury decides that the image of the Vuitton man will be placed in the hands of a black creator, trained as an engineer and an architect, who came from the universe of streetwear and from a brand, Off-White, that had learned to move comfortably between street culture and the most expensive showcases in the world. Virgil Abloh arrives at Vuitton with a biography that breaks several molds at the same time. The son of Ghanaian immigrants in the United States, he grows up in the suburbs of Chicago, listens to rap, becomes interested in skateboarding, studies civil engineering and later architecture, designs album covers, organizes parties, approaches the creative circle of Kanye West, and ends up collaborating with him on projects that mix music, fashion, and staging. All that trajectory has accustomed him to think of culture as a fabric of disciplines that intersect rather than as isolated compartments, and that way of seeing the world fits perfectly with an era in which the boundary between high fashion and streetwear had become blurred. That such a profile reaches the menswear direction of Louis Vuitton is a powerful sign of where the Maison wants to look. His first runway show, in June of the year 2018, becomes a scene that is already part of the recent history of luxury. The garden of the Palais Royal in Paris appears crossed by a runway of gradient colors that reproduce a rainbow, as if it were a symbolic route connecting different worlds. In the front row sit artists, musicians, designers, veteran industry figures, and young people who have learned to follow fashion shows from their mobile phones. When the first models appear, the references to The Wizard of Oz and to the idea of an initiatory journey become evident. The message is clear. Abloh is inviting the audience to walk with him along a path toward a new version of what it means to dress in luxury. The culminating moment comes at the end, when Virgil steps out to greet, walks toward Kanye West, and they embrace in a hug filled with emotion, tears, and silent understanding of what that scene represented. Two black boys who came from an environment far from the Paris of the salons, embraced at the heart of one of the most influential fashion houses. From that moment on, his proposal for the menswear line of Vuitton is constructed as a constant dialogue between classic codes and contemporary references. He takes the tailored suit, that absolute symbol of bourgeois dressing, and reinterprets it with broad shoulders, relaxed proportions, technical details, belts reminiscent of harnesses, vests that look like bulletproof vests, transformed into fashion pieces. He brings to the runway coats that mix military cuts with unexpected colors, garments inspired by uniforms but contaminated by the aesthetics of hip-hop and skateboarding. Sneakers, which for years had lived on the periphery of the formal world, become a central element of the proposal. Voluminous models, strong soles, luxury versions of sneaker culture that connect with young clients and with mature collectors willing to pay for an object that condenses the LV symbol and the memory of skate parks. His design, however, does not remain on the surface of the trend. It is accompanied by a very conscious discourse on representation, diversity, and dreams. Virgil speaks of his work as a tool to open doors that were previously closed. He repeats that he wants a black child, seeing a Vuitton campaign, to be able to imagine himself in that place, not as an exception but as a natural part of the image of success. His runway shows fill with models of different races, origins, and profiles. Soundtracks that mix classical music with rap are heard. Pieces appear that take symbols of African American culture and place them at the center of a runway historically dominated by other references. During those seasons, Vuitton begins to look less like a distant house and more like a stage where new identities are negotiated. From the business perspective, his arrival coincides with an explosion of interest in menswear. A generation of boys who grew up accustomed to hoodies and printed t-shirts begin to become interested in more elaborate garments, but they want those garments to speak their language. Virgil's suits offer exactly that, a way of dressing that is elevated but without losing the link to the street. Sales reflect this enthusiasm, revenues linked to the menswear line increase, waiting lists for certain sneakers and bags soar, and the brand's presence on social networks multiplies with every look that goes viral on Instagram or on specialized forums. The house, which had always had enormous weight in womenswear and in leather goods, sees how its menswear image gains prominence and becomes a reference for other firms that, from then on, will look for their own creative directors from the street. In the creative realm, Abloh introduces another important layer: his obsession with the idea of remix, and with the notion that nothing is born from nothing. He speaks openly about his references, cites uniforms, films, works of art, iconic dresses, work garments, and mixes them with transparency, as if inviting the viewer to see the backstage of creation. That attitude, which breaks with the false idea of isolated genius, connects with a generation accustomed to memes, to mashups, to the constant remixing of images. In the hands of Virgil, Louis Vuitton becomes a kind of laboratory that demonstrates that luxury can be profoundly cultured and at the same time made of fragments of popular culture. The cultural impact of his work can be seen in concrete details that, over time, become symbols. The harness worn by Timothée Chalamet on a red carpet, the reflective vests reinterpreted as runway pieces, the bags shaped like toy cars, the collections inspired by childhood, by faith, by fragility and by strength. Each of those gestures carries behind it a reflection on how to dress a man who no longer needs to prove his masculinity with rigidity, but can play, be moved, show vulnerability without ceasing to be powerful. Vuitton thus becomes a space where masculine sensitivity expands and becomes more complex. Off the runway, Virgil continues acting as a bridge between worlds. He maintains his work with Off-White, collaborates with sports brands, designs album covers, participates in conferences, speaks with students, uses his fame as a platform to inspire young designers who do not come from the traditional paths of haute couture. That hyperactivity generates criticism. Some accuse him of spreading himself too thin, of being in too many places at once. But that multiplicity is precisely part of his identity, representing the mentality of an era in which the borders between disciplines have blurred. For Vuitton, having a creative director who appears at music festivals, in museums, and at universities means extending the reach of the brand far beyond the usual channels of fashion. And then, when it seemed that his presence in the Maison was destined to last many years, news arrives that shakes the world of culture and the general public. In November of the year 2021, the death of Virgil Abloh is announced, after a private battle against a rare cancer that he had carried in silence. The reaction is immediate and massive. Tributes follow one after the other on social networks, in media outlets, and on runways. Friends and colleagues remember shared work. Interviews are brought back in which he spoke about the importance of dreaming big, of breaking barriers, of showing your 15-year-old self that you made it here. For Louis Vuitton, the loss is double. A creative director who had transformed the menswear line is gone, and at the same time a figure who had become a symbol of a historical turning point for the Maison. The brand organizes a final posthumous runway show in Miami, a kind of celebration of his legacy where his ideas, his colors, his volumes, and his recurring symbols are revisited, and the atmosphere has something of farewell and collective gratitude. Beyond the tears and the speeches, there remains the feeling that Virgil opened a door that can no longer be closed, because he demonstrated that a creator who emerged from streetwear can lead a centuries-old house without distorting it, that diversity is not a cosmetic gesture but a real engine of innovation, and that the codes of luxury can be rewritten when seen from angles that were previously excluded. After his death, Louis Vuitton faces the challenge of continuing that conversation without falling into the simple imitation of his style, understanding that the most faithful way to honor his spirit is not to copy his designs, but to keep alive that will to cross worlds, to give space to new voices, and to connect the monogram with the cultural rhythms of the present. And it is precisely in that search for a continuity that honors what he began where the Maison will open itself to a new creative stage that will once again surprise the world. Pharrell and the new Vuitton era. When Louis Vuitton announces in the year 2023 that Pharrell Williams will be the new creative director of the menswear line, the fashion world pauses for an instant, because the choice confirms something that had already been hinted at since the era of Virgil Abloh. The Maison has decided that its future depends on embracing popular culture directly, without filters, inviting those who have spent years setting the rhythm of music, art, and the street to steer the direction of a house that, for a long time, was a symbol of distant elegance. With Pharrell, the gesture expands, because he is someone who has spent 2 decades being a reference at the intersection of hip-hop, streetwear, design, and pop sensibility, an artist who has moved between worlds with a naturalness that fits perfectly with the spirit of a luxury that no longer wants to be rigid. Pharrell does not arrive at Vuitton as a stranger who suddenly peeks into the universe of design. His history is full of collaborations with sports brands, projects with fashion houses, sneaker lines that sold out in minutes, and above all, a way of dressing that made him a style icon long before assuming any official position. His hats, his chains, his mixtures of classic garments with technical pieces, his colored jewelry, and his playful use of clothing have made many people, upon seeing him, feel that luxury can be fun, lighthearted, and at the same time profoundly thought out. For that figure to take the lead of the menswear line of Louis Vuitton means that the Maison recognizes the power of those who have known how to influence fashion from outside traditional circuits. His first show, in June of the year 2023, becomes a manifesto in motion. The runway is not built just anywhere, but on the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, facing the Seine and next to the historical headquarters of the Maison. And that choice already tells a story. The most classic French luxury surrounded by a scenography filled with music, projected lights, and a city that becomes part of the performance. From the stands, musicians, athletes, actors, content creators, and people who represent both the old guard of luxury and the new aristocracy of digital attention sit side by side. The collection plays with the yellow damier, with reinterpretations of the classic checkboard, with tailored suits that coexist with wide parkas, synthetic fur coats, and elevated versions of the work jacket turned into objects of desire. The show is not only fashion, it is a concert, an urban spectacle, a clear message that Vuitton wants to be where things are happening. In Pharrell's proposal, an obsession with the idea of casual luxury is perceived, a way of dressing that does not renounce noble materials nor precise tailoring, but that feels comfortable, livable, close to the real bodies of people who move between recording studios, stadiums, airports, and events. The suits relax without losing structure. The coats are covered in graphic motifs. The monogram reappears in new forms, sometimes embroidered in pearls, other times reinterpreted with color gradients, while glasses, hats, and jewelry become protagonists of looks that transmit self-confidence and a desire to play. The Vuitton man, according to Pharrell, can dress like a film director, like a music producer, or like a football player who has just won a final, and in all cases the same mixture of elegance and ease is recognized. One of the keys of his approach is the way he connects the Maison with sports, especially with football, which in the 21st century has transformed into one of the largest visibility platforms on the planet. The agreement to dress Real Madrid, one of the most followed clubs in the world, brings Vuitton into a field that for a long time had been dominated by purely technical kit. Here, luxury enters the scene in the players' suits, in travel pieces, in accessories that accompany the footballers when they walk through tunnels and improvised red carpets on their way to the locker room. And that presence multiplies the audience of the brand, because each match becomes a showcase for millions of people. In Pharrell's vision, the players are not only athletes, they are characters in a global narrative that deserves clothing equal to their cultural impact. His work also dialogues with other spaces where fashion and storytelling meet, such as the Met Gala, that event in New York in which the carpet becomes a stage for looks conceived as artistic statements. Pharrell uses these opportunities to build memorable images that, the next day, travel the world through websites, social networks, and conversations. The tailored suits, the details inspired by Afro-diasporic histories, the references to Black cultural heritage and its struggles integrate into the Vuitton aesthetic with a balance that mixes respect and boldness, demonstrating that luxury can be a vehicle of memory and of identity celebration at the same time. From a business perspective, his arrival maintains the momentum that Virgil Abloh had ignited in the menswear market, but reorients it slightly toward a territory where music occupies a central position. Pharrell is not only a designer, he is a producer with a very fine ear for detecting what will resonate strongly in the coming years. And he transfers that intuition to fashion, anticipating color combinations, ways of wearing garments, and details that will become trends. The collections generate immediate media buzz, and the star products, sneakers, unisex bags, glasses, jackets, enter the radar of young consumers, but also of veteran clients attracted by the fresh energy of the new narrative. In a world saturated with stimuli, that ability to create conversation is pure gold. Another important element in this stage is the way Pharrell understands the legacy of the Maison as a toolbox he can turn to in order to tell new stories. Unlike designers who approach history with fear, he allows himself to play with the damier, with the monogram, with the trunks, with the iconography of travel, and he relocates them in unexpected contexts. A classic trunk can transform into a speaker, into an artistic object, into the central piece of an installation. A traditional pattern becomes a kind of giant pixel that covers coats and blankets. The campaigns use boats, antique cars, African landscapes, futuristic cities, all arranged in a mosaic that reflects the idea that luxury today is not belonging to a single place, but being able to inhabit several worlds at once. For an entrepreneur observing this evolution from the outside, the lesson is clear. A long-standing brand that wants to remain relevant must learn to invite creators who are not limited to repeating formulas, but who contribute their own complete universe with their references, their history, and their community. Pharrell brings with him decades of relationships in music, art, and urban culture. He brings with him an audience that trusts his taste, that has grown older with him, that saw him go from producer in the shadows to recognizable star, and that personal credibility transfers to Vuitton, just as it previously occurred with Virgil Abloh. The Maison does not hire only a creative, it establishes a bridge to an entire cultural ecosystem. With time, his era will consolidate its own vocabulary within the history of the brand, made of honey-colored suits, peace symbols, nods to the world of early 2000 hip-hop, and a use of color that breaks with the dominant sobriety in many menswear wardrobes. And as those images accumulate, it becomes clear that Louis Vuitton has become something more than a luxury house that sells expensive products. It is a platform where artists, athletes, musicians, designers, and consumers meet to be part of a global conversation about style, success, and belonging. In that scenario, in which each collection seems like an event, and each collaboration becomes an instant object of desire, it becomes even more meaningful to pause and analyze the role that strategic alliances, limited capsules, and the game of hype have had in building desire around the brand. A game that Vuitton has learned to master through the last decades with an almost surgical instinct. Collaborations, hype, and legendary capsules. If we look at the recent history of Louis Vuitton as if it were a graph, we will see a line that rises with force in the moments when the Maison decides to open its doors to other creative universes and turn the monogram into a shared playground. Collaborations then become something more than a marketing trick. They are sparks that reignite desire when the logo runs the risk of becoming part of the landscape, exercises of calculated risk in which the house places itself in the hands of artists, brands or creators who arrive with their own language, their own community, and their own way of understanding luxury. The first major alliances of the contemporary era, guided by Marc Jacobs, were almost a declaration of intentions. With Steven Sprouse, the fluorescent graffiti that invaded the traditional brown canvas was an act of irreverence that dismantled the solemnity surrounding the monogram. Suddenly, a historical symbol appeared covered in fast letters, as if something born in the street had decided to claim the most untouchable object of the luxury wardrobe. That unexpected clash generated an immediate reaction. The bags sold out, the waiting lists grew, and what could have been a simple capsule became public proof that Vuitton was willing to laugh a little at itself without losing control. The collaboration with Takashi Murakami took the idea one step further. With the multicolored monogram on white or black background, the smiling cherry motifs, and the flowers that looked as if they had been lifted from a psychedelic pop dream, those pieces arrived at a moment when the entire world was beginning to discover contemporary Japanese art, anime, and the kawaii aesthetic. And the Maison knew how to use that wave in its favor. Each bag, each wallet, functioned as a hybrid between accessory and artwork, something you could carry in your hand, and that at the same time seemed destined for a museum display. The result was explosive. The models became icons of the 2000s, reappeared for years in series, music videos, and posts on social networks, and they remain today objects of desire in the second-hand market. That type of collaboration changed forever the public's relationship with the logo. From that moment on, the monogram stopped being a rigid block and became a flexible system, capable of being remixed again and again. With Yayoi Kusama, for example, the surfaces filled with dots that seemed to expand without control, uniting the repetitive obsession of the Japanese artist with the repetitive pattern of Vuitton. With Jeff Koons, the masterpieces of classical painting were printed on bags and trunks, turning the Gioconda or Van Gogh into travel companions. Each alliance generated debate, enthusiasm, criticism, collecting, but all had something in common. They took a widely known symbol and reinterpreted it through another eye. The formula also expanded into the terrain of urban fashion and the most radical streetwear, with the historic collaboration with Supreme as the most evident example. In that capsule, presented on a runway that mixed skaters, suits, and references to the downtown scene of New York City, Louis Vuitton engaged in dialogue with a brand that, for years, had represented the essence of youthful hype, with endless lines in front of small stores and releases that disappeared in minutes. A red trunk with the logo of Supreme and the monogram of Louis Vuitton, shirts, sweatshirts, accessories, all of it functioned as a bridge between two cultures that seemed opposite and yet shared the same logic: the value of belonging to a circle that understands the code. In the era of Virgil Abloh, this game with collaboration reached a new degree of naturalness. His own creative practice came from there, from mixing Nike with Off-White, from intervening in classic sneakers, from treating each object as a canvas for an ironic or poetic commentary. Upon arriving at Vuitton, that mentality translated into capsules that reinvented the Air Force One with the monogram of Louis Vuitton, into projects with musicians and artists who did not limit themselves to lending their image but contributed a complete aesthetic. The result was a hype that no longer depended only on the product. It depended on the context, who was wearing it, where it was seen, what story stood behind each launch. From the business point of view, these capsules function as injections of adrenaline in the perception of the brand. They are produced in limited quantities, announced with carefully measured calendars, sometimes with casual leaks that awaken curiosity on social networks, and they arrive in stores on specific dates that turn the purchase into an event. The lines, the reservations, the lotteries, all are part of a scenery of desire where the product is experienced as an achievement. By selling out quickly, they fuel a resale market that multiplies their value and turns each launch into news, reinforcing the idea that Vuitton remains capable of generating coveted pieces that not everyone can obtain. However, this strategy of hype has a reverse side that the Maison knows well. If the formula is overused, if each collection begins to resemble an ephemeral drop, the public may grow tired, feel that everything responds to a trick of artificial scarcity, and the aura of luxury risks being confused with the logic of fast fashion, only expensive. For that reason, Vuitton takes great care in deciding what it collaborates on, with whom, how many times, and in what tone. There are years of relative calm, in which innovation focuses on ready-to-wear or jewelry, and years in which a capsule explodes in public conversation, almost always tied to a significant context, such as an anniversary, an exhibition, a change in creative direction, or an intentional dialogue with a cultural movement. For any person interested in entrepreneurship, what lies behind this way of working is a very fine understanding of how desire functions in the contemporary economy. The client no longer falls in love with a product only for its characteristics. They fall in love with the story that surrounds it, with the sensation of being in the right moment, with the awareness that this object belongs to a specific chapter in the narrative of the brand. The limited capsule, the unexpected collaboration, create small eras within the path of Vuitton, and whoever buys a piece feels that they are taking home a fragment of that moment. It is the opposite of what is generic or interchangeable. The recent collaborations with figures such as Tyler, the creator, or with creative collectives linked to skateboarding, rap, or local scenes in different cities, show that the Maison has understood that 21st century luxury is built by listening to many voices, not only looking inward. Each project of this type requires time, negotiation, adjustments of ego, coordination of teams, but in the long run it strengthens the bond with an audience that perceives authenticity in these dialogues and not simple opportunism. When a capsule feels organic, when it aligns with the trajectory of the guest and with the history of Vuitton, the effect multiplies. Of course, this strategic use of hype coexists with a stable line of permanent products, those models that have been in the catalog for decades and that function as the backbone of the business. Without that base, the capsules would lose their strength, because the extraordinary only makes sense when there is a well-established norm. The art of the Maison consists of shifting the focus between both levels. On one hand, the bag or trunk that can be inherited. On the other, the ephemeral piece that captures a specific cultural moment. And while the collaborations continue marking peaks of attention, the question that both the inside and the outside of the house begins to ask concerns the long term. How to ensure that this machine of desire continues functioning in a world where concerns about environmental impact, production ethics, and the meaning of accumulating objects gain more force each year. That tension between hype and responsibility, between fleeting capsule and lasting legacy, is what leads Louis Vuitton toward a terrain in which it will have to look directly at sustainability, transparency, and the challenges of a planet that no longer allows its limits to be ignored. Legacy, sustainability, and upcoming challenges. When we look at Louis Vuitton from the present, with its stores illuminating corners of half the planet, its viral collaborations and its creative directors turned into pop figures, it is easy to forget that everything began with a teenager walking alone toward Paris, carrying more questions than certainties, and that the thread connecting that journey with the current giant is not made of marketing or campaigns, but of a very specific idea repeated for more than 170 years, creating objects designed to last, capable of accompanying people in important moments of their lives, from a relocation to another country, to the first salary invested in a bag that symbolizes a personal achievement. That silent continuity is the nucleus of the legacy of the Maison. And at the same time, in the era we live in, it becomes its main challenge. Because the world is no longer satisfied with beautiful products, it now demands explanations about how, where, and at what cost they are created. Luxury has entered fully into the conversation about sustainability, and Louis Vuitton cannot hide behind its history to avoid that responsibility. Among other things, because its own promise of quality relies on the idea of resistance and longevity, concepts that, when used correctly, fit with a less wasteful mentality. The discourse of the brand begins to insist on this radical durability, on the possibility of repairing a bag, changing a metallic piece, restoring a canvas, extending the life of products until they pass from parents to children or from one generation to another, and that emphasis on repair is not just another service. It is a way of responding to the criticism of a fast consumption that burns objects at the same rhythm as trends. In the restoration workshops, pieces accumulate from different decades, and that image, the image of a current artisan adjusting a stitch that may have been sewn by the hands of an ancestor, carries enormous symbolic strength. At the same time, the Maison is forced to review what happens before the product is born. The origin of the leathers, the certifications of the forests that provide wood for the structures of the trunks, the impact of transportation on the carbon footprint, the energy consumed by factories and stores, the chemicals used in treatments and finishes. Outwardly, there is talk of climate objectives, of growing percentages of renewable energies, of alliances with conservation projects, and of innovation in materials, such as recycled textiles, leathers of controlled origin, or alternatives that reduce the dependence on finite resources. Inwardly, there are constant discussions between design, production, and finance about how to balance the cost of these changes with the requirement to maintain healthy margins in a group that trades on the stock market. The tension is evident. On one hand, luxury lives from a certain exuberance, from the sensation that the object does not know the limitations of daily life. On the other hand, the contemporary client is increasingly aware that this exuberance has an ecological and social price. Louis Vuitton has begun to use this tension as a creative engine, presenting collections that integrate reused materials, capsules based on historical archives, reinterpreted with a reuse focus, and projects that explore circularity, whether through repurchase programs, certified vintage pieces, or historical trunks restored for new uses. It is not only about extinguishing reputational fires, but about transforming the client's relationship with the time of the object, inviting the client to think in decades instead of seasons. In parallel with this shift toward responsibility, the Maison expands into territories where luxury does not only involve what is worn or carried in the hand, but also what is applied on the skin. The perfumery lines have opened the path, with fragrances that attempt to translate travel, landscapes, and memory into olfactory notes. And in recent years, the universe of beauty and makeup has gained space as a more accessible entry door into the world of Vuitton. A lipstick, a palette, a foundation, or a highlighter become objects that carry the seal of the house to faces that perhaps cannot yet or do not wish to invest in a bag, but do want to participate in the narrative of the brand. From a business perspective, this has a very clear logic: diversifying without devaluing, expanding the range of products without turning the brand into something banal, working with ambassadors and renowned makeup artists who reinforce both the creative and the aspirational dimension. The digital world also pushes the Maison into territories Louis or Georges would never have imagined. We are no longer speaking only of electronic commerce, but of hybrid experiences, where a runway show is broadcast live through social platforms, where a bag is presented simultaneously in a physical show and in an interactive campaign, where the community comments, shares, and criticizes in real time. Even virtual universes and the so-called metaverse have served as laboratories to experiment with digital pieces, skins, augmented reality environments, and forms of presence that do not depend on leather or canvas, but on pixels and lines of code. The challenge in this area lies in not falling into the mere passing trend of the technological world, and instead using these new channels to reinforce the idea of creativity and exclusivity, not to dilute it in noise. Another front that the Maison cannot ignore is the social pressure surrounding transparency and labor conditions. It is increasingly difficult to hide the reality of supply chains, subcontractors, and external workshops, and clients, especially the younger generations, want to know who has sewn, who has dyed, who has cut each piece. Louis Vuitton is obliged to respond with reports, audits, certifications, but above all, with real changes in the way it relates to its workers and suppliers. Luxury in the 21st century begins to be defined also by what is not seen on the label. Dignified wages, training, care of the local environment, investment in the territories where production takes place. For a house built upon the pride of artisans, reconnecting with that idea of dignity in work becomes both a moral need and a competitive advantage. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the Vuitton case offers in this final phase of its history a set of very powerful lessons. The first has to do with the importance of long-term vision. A company born in the year 1854 and still relevant almost 2 centuries later is a demonstration that brands can be vehicles of time, capable of surviving wars, crises, technological revolutions, and changes in taste, as long as they know how to reinterpret their core without betraying it. The second lesson speaks of the value of adaptability. From trunks for carriages to bags for airplanes, from suitcases to pret-a-porter, from the classic monogram to collaborations with artists, from the artisanal workshop to the digital ecosystem, every turn has required courage to take risks. The third focuses on the delicate balance between expansion and desire, between being present everywhere and preserving the mystery that makes an object remain special when someone holds it in their hands for the first time. And perhaps the most intimate teaching of this story emerges when we think of that boy from the Jura who decided to walk several hundred kilometers to bet on an image of himself that did not yet exist. Luxury, beyond bags and runways, has much to do with that capacity to imagine a different future and to work with discipline to move closer to it, even when the environment seems to repeat that it is impossible. Louis Vuitton, as a company, has faced that test in every generation, has had to earn its place again in a changing world, and the fact that today we continue speaking of the Maison as a reference indicates that, for now, it keeps finding the way to do so. The rest of its story, the part that has not yet been written, will depend on its ability to look forward without forgetting that everything began with a journey on foot, a toolbox, and an enormous faith in what well-trained hands could achieve. Thank you for accompanying me on this fascinating journey through the history of Louis Vuitton, a brand that was born from a dream and ended up changing the world of luxury forever. If you enjoyed this story, tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most and what other story you would like to hear in upcoming videos. And if you have not done so yet, I invite you to subscribe so you do not miss any new documentary on the channel. Good night.